Welcome back, night owls and history lovers. I'm here to take you on another journey through time, one that might just be the perfect companion for your evening wind down. Before we dive into tonight's story, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button and join our community of fellow history enthusiasts. And if you're enjoying these late-night historical journeys, show some love with a like. It really helps the channel grow. Now, I'm curious, where are you listening to this from tonight? Drop a comment and let me know where this piece of history is finding you. Tonight's tale will transport you to the 6 words that convinced Hitler to declare war on America. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin this journey together. Welcome to tonight's journey through history's most fateful decision. As you settle in for this evening's story, imagine for a moment that you hold in your hands the power to determine the outcome of the greatest war in human history. One conversation, one decision, one moment of miscalculation could change everything. Tonight we explore exactly such a moment, when 6 words spoken in a Berlin office on December 11th, 1941, sealed the fate of Nazi Germany forever. The words were simple, almost casual. We must support our Japanese allies. They were spoken by Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop to Adolf Hitler during a brief morning conference that lasted less than 30 minutes. Yet those 6 words would transform World War II from a regional conflict into a truly global catastrophe. And more importantly for our story tonight, they would guarantee Nazi Germany's ultimate destruction. 4 days earlier, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor had shocked the world and brought the United States into war with Japan. But America was not yet at war with Germany. Hitler could have chosen to remain neutral, to let America exhaust itself fighting Japan in the Pacific, while Germany consolidated its gains in Europe and finished off Britain. Instead, those 6 words from Ribbentrop would convince him to make what historians now call the single greatest mistake of World War II, declaring war on the most powerful industrial nation on earth. This is the story of how a decision made in 30 minutes doomed an empire that Hitler boasted would last 1,000 years. As we explore this pivotal moment together, let the weight of history guide you toward peaceful contemplation of how the fate of nations can turn on the smallest of moments. December 7th, 1941, a day of infamy. The morning of December 7th, 1941, dawned clear and peaceful over Pearl Harbor. By 7:55 a.m. Hawaiian time, that peace would be shattered forever by the thunder of Japanese aircraft engines and the explosion of bombs and torpedoes. The surprise attack lasted just 75 minutes, but in that brief span, Japan had killed over 2,400 Americans, sunk or damaged 18 ships, and destroyed nearly 200 aircraft. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler was asleep when the first reports reached the Reich Chancellery. It was already evening in Germany when the attack began, and the initial reports were fragmentary and confused. Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer and confidant, was among the first to bring word to the Führer. He found Hitler in his private study, reviewing architectural plans for the reconstruction of Berlin, dreaming of the grand capital his 1,000-year Reich would build once the war was won. The news electrified Hitler. For months he had been urging Japan to strike at Britain's Eastern Empire, hoping to draw British resources away from the fight in North Africa and the Mediterranean. But Japan had done something far more significant. It had attacked America directly, brutally, without warning. Hitler's first reaction was pure elation. "Now it is impossible for us to lose the war," he told his inner circle. "We now have an ally who has never been defeated in 3,000 years." But Hitler's joy was premixed with a fundamental misunderstanding of what had just occurred. The Japanese attack, devastating as it was, had not crippled America's ability to wage war. It had merely awakened a sleeping giant and filled it with terrible purpose. More critically for Germany's future, Hitler failed to grasp that he now held in his hands the power to determine whether America would focus its wrath solely on Japan or whether he would invite that wrath upon himself, the American industrial colossus. To understand the magnitude of Hitler's miscalculation, we must first comprehend what America represented in 1941. While Germany had spent years building a war economy, America in peacetime already possessed industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Europe had ever seen. American factories produced more steel in a single year than Germany and Britain combined. American shipyards, if fully mobilized, could build vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. American aircraft factories, given time to reach full production, could fill the skies with more planes than the Luftwaffe had ever possessed. Perhaps most ominously for Germany, America possessed something that no European nation could match: geographic security. Germany's cities could be bombed, its supply lines disrupted, its territory invaded. America sat protected by two vast oceans, its industrial heartland beyond the reach of any enemy. Given time to mobilize, America could devote its full industrial might to war without fear of retaliation against its productive capacity. Hitler knew these facts, at least intellectually. His own armaments minister, Albert Speer, had shown him detailed intelligence reports on American productive capacity. The numbers were sobering. America could produce twice as many aircraft as Germany, 3 times as many ships, 4 times as much steel. If America chose to enter the European war with full commitment, Germany would face an enemy whose industrial resources exceeded those of all the European powers combined. But Hitler, in December 1941, believed he had found a solution to the American problem. Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor had, in his mind, solved the riddle of how to prevent America from bringing its full weight to bear against Germany. America would now be forced to fight a two-front war, dividing its attention and resources between the Pacific and Europe. Better still, the Japanese Navy, which Hitler believed to be invincible, would tie down American naval forces in the Pacific for years to come. It was a logical analysis based on a fatal assumption that Japan could actually defeat or permanently contain American power in the Pacific. Hitler's understanding of Japanese military capability was based largely on their impressive conquests in China and Southeast Asia. What he failed to grasp was that Japan's victories had come against opponents who were either weakened by other conflicts or unprepared for modern warfare. America was neither. Despite the shock of Pearl Harbor, America retained most of its productive capacity intact and would soon reveal itself to be a far more formidable opponent than Hitler had imagined. Roosevelt's dilemma. In Washington, President Franklin D. Roosevelt faced a profound strategic dilemma. The Japanese attack had made war with Japan inevitable, but it had not automatically brought America into conflict with Germany. The tripartite pact between Germany, Italy, and Japan was a defensive alliance. It obligated the signatories to support each other only if one of them was attacked. Them was attacked, not if one of them launched an attack against a third party. Roosevelt desperately wanted to bring America into the European war. He believed correctly that Nazi Germany posed a fundamental threat to democratic civilization. He had already pushed the boundaries of neutrality as far as possible, providing Britain with weapons through Lend-Lease, escorting convoys partway across the Atlantic, and even engaging German U-boats in undeclared naval warfare. But American public opinion remained strongly opposed to involvement in Europe's war. Pearl Harbor had changed American attitudes toward Japan, but not necessarily toward Germany. Roosevelt knew that if he tried to use the Japanese attack as justification for declaring war on Germany, he would face fierce opposition from isolationists in Congress and across the country. Americans were united in their desire for revenge against Japan, but many still hoped to avoid entanglement in Europe's ancient quarrels. Roosevelt's military advisers were equally concerned about the prospect of a two-front war. American military planning had long assumed that if the United States entered World War II, it would focus primarily on defeating Germany, while maintaining a defensive posture in the Pacific. The so-called Germany First strategy reflected the military's assessment that Nazi Germany posed the greater long-term threat to American security. But Pearl Harbor had created enormous public pressure to prioritize the war against Japan. If Hitler had chosen to remain neutral after Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt would have faced an agonizing choice. He could have focused American efforts on the Pacific War, leaving Britain to face Germany alone, or he could have tried to convince the American people to fight a major war in Europe while still dealing with Japanese aggression in the Pacific. Either choice would have been politically dangerous and strategically problematic. Hitler's decision to declare war on America solved Roosevelt's dilemma completely. By bringing Germany into the war himself, Hitler eliminated all domestic American opposition to the European conflict. No longer would Roosevelt need to justify fighting Hitler, while Japan remained undefeated. Germany had made itself America's enemy, and the American people would support whatever measures were necessary to achieve victory over both Axis powers. December 8th to 10th, 3 days of deliberation. In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Hitler did not act rashly. Despite his initial euphoria, he understood that declaring war on America was a momentous decision that required careful consideration. For 3 days, from December 8th to December 10th, he consulted with his closest advisers, military commanders, and foreign policy experts. The discussions were intense, sometimes heated, and ultimately revealed fundamental divisions within the Nazi leadership about Germany's strategic situation. The most important of these consultations took place on the morning of December 9th, in Hitler's private office at the Reich Chancellery. Present were Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, Admiral Erich Raeder, commander of the German Navy, General Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Armed Forces High Command, and General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations. Also in attendance was Heinrich Himmler, representing the SS and Nazi Party leadership. The meeting began with Raeder presenting the Navy's assessment of the strategic situation. The Admiral was cautiously optimistic about the opportunities created by Pearl Harbor, but he also understood the enormous risks involved in adding America to Germany's list of enemies. Mein Führer, Raeder began, the Japanese attack has created both opportunities and dangers for the Reich. If we can coordinate our U-boat operations with Japanese naval actions, we might be able to cut Britain's supply lines permanently. But we must also consider that American industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, will exceed our ability to counter it. Hitler listened impatiently to Raeder's measured analysis. The Führer had never been comfortable with nuanced strategic thinking, preferring bold action to careful calculation. "Admiral," he interrupted, "you speak of American industrial capacity as if it were already deployed against us. But America must now divide its attention between two oceans. They cannot focus their full strength against us, while Japan threatens their Pacific empire." General Jodl supported Hitler's assessment, though with less enthusiasm than the Führer displayed. "The Japanese Navy is indeed formidable," Jodl observed. "Their carrier force has proven its effectiveness at Pearl Harbor. If they can maintain pressure on American naval forces in the Pacific, it will significantly limit America's ability to intervene in European waters." But it was Ribbentrop who would provide the crucial argument that sealed Germany's fate. The foreign minister had been instrumental in negotiating the tripartite pact with Japan, and he saw the current crisis as vindication of his diplomatic efforts. More importantly, Ribbentrop understood Hitler's psychology better than anyone else in the room. He knew that the Führer responded to arguments that combined ideological conviction with apparent strategic logic. "Mein Führer," Ribbentrop said, his voice carrying the confidence that had made him one of Hitler's most trusted advisers, "we face a moment of unprecedented opportunity. For 2 years, we have fought with one hand tied behind our backs, unable to attack American shipping directly, forced to watch as Roosevelt sends weapons to our enemies while claiming neutrality. The Japanese attack has freed us from these constraints. We can now wage unrestricted submarine warfare against American shipping, something our naval commanders have been requesting for months." Ribbentrop paused for effect, then delivered the argument that would prove decisive. "But beyond the immediate tactical advantages, there is a deeper strategic imperative. We have allied ourselves with Japan because we recognize that this war is not merely about territory or resources. It is about the future of civilization itself. The forces of international capitalism and Bolshevism have combined against us, aided by America's Jewish-influenced government. If we fail to support our Japanese allies now, when they have struck such a magnificent blow against our common enemy, we will be seen as unreliable partners. Our alliance with Japan will become meaningless, and we will face the combined might of our enemies alone." The foreign minister's words resonated powerfully with Hitler's worldview. Throughout his political career, the Führer had seen international relations through the lens of racial and ideological struggle. The war, in Hitler's mind, was not simply a conflict between nations, but a cosmic battle between opposing forces of history. Germany and Japan represented the forces of order, strength, and racial purity. America, Britain, and the Soviet Union represented the forces of chaos, weakness, and racial mixing, manipulated by what Hitler saw as an international Jewish conspiracy. From this perspective, supporting Japan was not merely a matter of strategic convenience, it was a moral and ideological necessity. If Germany failed to stand with Japan in its hour of triumph, Hitler believed it would betray the fundamental principles for which the war was being fought. The alliance with Japan represented something larger than military cooperation. It embodied the unity of what Hitler called the ascending races against the declining democracies of the West, the words that sealed Germany's fate. The crucial moment came on the morning of December 11th, during a brief private meeting between Hitler and Ribbentrop. The foreign minister had spent the previous evening drafting Germany's declaration of war against the United States, but Hitler had not yet given final approval for its delivery. The two men met in Hitler's private study, the same room where the Führer had first learned of the Pearl Harbor attack 4 days earlier. The conversation was brief but decisive. Hitler began by expressing his concerns about the timing of the declaration. "Perhaps we should wait," he mused, "until our position in Russia is more secure. Winter is proving more difficult than we anticipated, and adding another enemy might complicate our strategic situation." Ribbentrop's response was immediate and emphatic. He had spent years cultivating his relationship with Hitler, learning exactly how to present arguments that would appeal to the Führer's instincts and prejudices. He understood that Hitler respected bold action more than cautious calculation, loyalty more than pragmatism, ideological purity more than strategic flexibility. "Mein Führer," Ribbentrop replied, his voice carrying absolute conviction. "We cannot hesitate now. The Japanese have struck a magnificent blow against our common enemies. They have shown the world that American power is not invincible, that the Anglo-Saxon powers can be defeated by those who possess the will to fight. If we fail to support them now, we will be seen as weak and unreliable. Our enemies will be emboldened, our allies will lose faith in us, and the momentum created by Pearl Harbor will be lost forever." Then came the 6 words that would doom Nazi Germany. "We must support our Japanese allies." The simplicity of the statement masked its profound implications. in that moment, with those 6 words, Ribbentrop had provided Hitler with the justification he needed to make the most fateful decision of his career. The words appealed simultaneously to Hitler's sense of honor, his strategic calculations, and his ideological convictions. They suggested that supporting Japan was not merely an option but an obligation, not merely strategically advantageous but morally imperative. Hitler's response was immediate. "You are absolutely right," he declared. "Prepare the declaration for delivery this afternoon. We will show the world that Germany stands with its allies, that we do not fear American power, that the forces of order and strength will not bow to the corruption and weakness of the democratic nations." With those words, Hitler committed Germany to a 2-front war against enemies whose combined industrial capacity exceeded his own by a factor of more than 10 to 1. He had transformed what might have remained a regional conflict in the Pacific into a truly global war in which Germany would face not only the British Empire and the Soviet Union, but also the full industrial and military might of the United States. The irony was profound. Ribbentrop's 6 words were intended to preserve German strength by maintaining the alliance with Japan. Instead, they ensured Germany's destruction by bringing America fully into the European war. The foreign minister believed he was advising Hitler to choose loyalty over expediency, honor over pragmatism. In reality, he was convincing the Führer to commit strategic suicide. December 11th, 1941, the die is cast. At precisely 3 p.m. on December 11th, 1941, Adolf Hitler strode into the Reichstag building in Berlin to deliver what would prove to be one of the most consequential speeches in human history. The assembled deputies, generals, and Nazi officials had no idea they were about to witness their leader's most catastrophic decision. The speech would last 90 minutes, but its most important moment would come in a single sentence that transformed World War II from a European conflict with Pacific complications into a truly global war that would consume 60 million lives. The Reichstag Hall was packed to capacity. Representatives from all corners of the German Empire had gathered to hear their Führer's pronouncement on the new world situation created by Pearl Harbor. The atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Germany's recent military successes had filled the Nazi leadership with confidence. Leningrad was under siege, Moscow was threatened, and German forces were advancing toward the oil fields of the Caucasus. Many in the audience expected Hitler to announce new victories, perhaps the fall of the Soviet capital or a breakthrough in North Africa. Hitler began his speech with his characteristic blend of historical grievance and ideological rhetoric. For the first hour, he recounted what he portrayed as a long series of American provocations against the German Reich. He spoke of President Roosevelt's criminal support for Britain through Lend-Lease, the illegal occupation of Iceland by American forces, and the aggressive actions of the US Navy in escorting British convoys across the Atlantic. "The President of the United States," Hitler declared, his voice rising with indignation, "has steadily committed ever more serious acts of provocation against Germany. He has systematically prepared for war while hypocritically claiming to pursue peace. Under the influence of advisers who represent international Jewish interests rather than American ones, Roosevelt has transformed the United States into an instrument of aggression against the German people." The anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that followed were typical of Hitler's rhetoric, but they served a crucial purpose in the context of his decision to declare war. By portraying America as a tool of what he called international Jewry, Hitler was attempting to fit his declaration of war into the larger ideological framework that justified Nazi aggression. The war was not simply about territory or resources. It was about the survival of the German race against forces that sought its destruction. But the most significant portion of the speech came when Hitler turned to the subject of Japan and the alliance between the Axis powers. His words, carefully crafted with Ribbentrop's assistance, would echo those 6 fatal words spoken in private that morning. We must support our Japanese allies. The German people have found in Japan an ally who has never been conquered in 3,000 years of history, Hitler proclaimed. When Japan struck its magnificent blow against American naval power at Pearl Harbor, it struck a blow for all nations that refused to bow to Anglo-Saxon imperialism. Germany stands proudly beside Japan in this struggle, and we will fight side by side until victory is achieved. Then came the moment that sealed Germany's fate. Hitler's voice rose to a crescendo as he delivered the words that would transform the strategic landscape of World War II. I have therefore arranged for His Excellency, the American Chargé d'Affaires, to be handed his passports today, and have informed him that the German Reich, forced into this conflict by the United States of America under its present president, regards itself as in a state of war with the United States, as from today. The Reichstag erupted in applause. Deputies leaped to their feet, raising their arms in Nazi salutes, shouting, "Sieg Heil!" with apparent enthusiasm. But beneath the orchestrated celebration, some of Germany's most experienced military and diplomatic officials felt a chill of apprehension. They understood what Hitler seemed unable to grasp, that Germany had just declared war on the most powerful industrial nation on earth, while already engaged in a life-and-death struggle with the Soviet Union. Admiral Raeder, sitting in the military section of the Reichstag, later wrote in his diary about his thoughts during that moment. As I listened to the Führer's words, I could not shake the feeling that we had just signed our own death warrant. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor was indeed a magnificent tactical success, but it has awakened a sleeping giant whose industrial capacity exceeds our own by an enormous margin. We are now committed to fight not only Britain and Russia, but also America. The odds against us have just become overwhelming. General Holder, Chief of the Army General Staff, was even more pessimistic. In his personal notes he wrote, December 11th, 1941, the day Germany lost the war. By declaring war on America, the Führer has made it impossible for us to concentrate our forces against any single enemy. We will now face the combined industrial might of 3 great powers, while our own resources are already stretched to the breaking point. This decision may prove to be the greatest strategic blunder in military history. The immediate consequences. The immediate reaction in Washington to Hitler's declaration was one of relief, mixed with grim determination. President Roosevelt had been dreading the prospect of having to ask Congress to declare war on Germany, while the American people were focused on seeking revenge against Japan. Hitler's declaration eliminated that political problem entirely. Within hours of receiving word from Berlin, Roosevelt appeared before Congress to request recognition that a state of war now existed between the United States and Germany. The congressional response was swift and overwhelming. With only one dissenting vote from Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, who had also voted against war in 1917, Congress formally recognized the state of war with Germany and Italy. The vote was completed by 3 p.m. Washington time, just 12 hours after Hitler's speech in Berlin. More importantly, Hitler's declaration unified American public opinion behind the war effort in a way that Roosevelt could never have achieved through his own political leadership. Overnight, the isolationist movement that had opposed American involvement in European affairs collapsed. The America First Committee, which had been the leading voice for neutrality, disbanded within days of Hitler's declaration. Charles Lindbergh, the committee's most prominent spokesman, publicly announced his support for the war effort and offered his services to the military. The industrial consequences were even more dramatic. American factories that had been producing weapons for Britain under Lend-Lease now began retooling for full wartime production. The arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt called it, began to mobilize on a scale unprecedented in human history. Within months, American shipyards would be launching cargo vessels faster than German U-boats could sink them. American aircraft factories would be producing bombers and fighters in quantities that would ultimately overwhelm German air defenses. Perhaps most ominously for Germany, American scientists and engineers began work on projects that would fundamentally alter the nature of warfare. The Manhattan Project, which would ultimately produce the atomic bomb, received increased funding and priority immediately after Hitler's declaration of war. While the atomic bomb would not be ready in time to effect the European war, its development represented the kind of technological innovation that American industrial capacity made possible. The view from London. In London, Winston Churchill received news of Hitler's declaration with undisguised joy. The British Prime Minister had been pressing Roosevelt for months to bring America more fully into the European war, but he had understood the political constraints that limited American action. Pearl Harbor had brought America into the war, but Churchill feared that American attention would be diverted entirely to the Pacific, leaving Britain to face Germany alone. Hitler's declaration changed everything. "So we had won after all," Churchill wrote in his memoirs about that moment. "England would live, Britain would live, the Commonwealth of Nations and the Empire would live. How long the war would last, or in what fashion it would end, no man could tell, nor did I at this moment care. Once again in our Long Island history we should emerge, however mauled or mutilated, safe and victorious." Churchill immediately began planning for closer coordination with American military forces. The Combined Chiefs of Staff system, which would coordinate Allied strategy throughout the war, was established within weeks of Hitler's declaration. The Lend-Lease program, which had been politically controversial in America, was expanded and accelerated. Most importantly, Churchill and Roosevelt began planning for Operation Overlord, the massive invasion of continental Europe that would ultimately drive Germany to surrender. But Churchill also understood the magnitude of Hitler's strategic error better than most. In a private conversation with his military aide, General Hastings Ismay, Churchill observed, "Hitler has just committed the greatest blunder of his career. He could have left America to exhaust itself fighting Japan while we faced Germany alone. Instead, he has created the alliance that will destroy him. The industrial might of America, the determination of Britain and the manpower of Russia, that combination is invincible. Hitler has just guaranteed his own defeat." The myth of Japanese invincibility. Hitler's decision to declare war on America was based fundamentally on his assessment of Japanese military capabilities. Throughout 1941, German intelligence services had provided Hitler with detailed reports on Japanese military successes in China and Southeast Asia. These reports painted a picture of Japanese forces as uniquely effective, disciplined, and capable of sustained military operations across vast distances. The Pearl Harbor attack seemed to confirm these assessments. In a single morning, Japanese naval aviation had crippled the American Pacific Fleet, killed over 2,400 Americans, and demonstrated tactical and strategic capabilities that impressed military observers around the world. German naval officials were particularly impressed by the coordination required to launch such a complex operation across thousands of miles of ocean while maintaining complete secrecy. But Hitler's admiration for Japanese military prowess was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the strategic balance in the Pacific. The Pearl Harbor attack, devastating as it was, had been a tactical success that failed to achieve its strategic objectives. The Japanese had sunk or damaged 18 American ships, but they had failed to destroy Pearl Harbor's fuel storage facilities, repair shops, and submarine base. More critically, they had failed to locate and destroy the American aircraft carriers, which were at sea during the attack. German intelligence assessments of Japanese capabilities also suffered from a lack of understanding about American industrial and military potential. Hitler believed that Japan's early victories in Southeast Asia demonstrated inherent Japanese superiority over Western military forces. He failed to recognize that these victories had come against colonial forces that were undermanned, under-equipped, and unprepared for modern warfare. The British forces in Malaya, the Dutch forces in the East Indies, and the American forces in the Philippines were all woefully inadequate for the tasks they faced. More fundamentally, Hitler misunderstood the nature of American military potential. He saw America as a nation of merchants and industrialists, soft and unprepared for the harsh realities of modern warfare. This assessment was reinforced by German propaganda that portrayed Americans as racially mixed, culturally degenerate, and morally weak. The idea that such a nation could produce effective military forces seemed laughable to Nazi ideologues. The reality was starkly different. America in 1941 possessed the world's most advanced aviation industry, the most sophisticated shipbuilding capabilities, and the most productive manufacturing base. Once mobilized for war, American industry would produce military equipment in quantities that exceeded the combined output of all Axis nations. The B-24 Liberator bomber, for example, would ultimately be produced in greater numbers than any other American military aircraft in history, over 18,000 units. The entire German aircraft industry produced fewer than 40,000 military aircraft during the entire war. Hitler's misassessment of Japanese capabilities was compounded by his ignorance of American strategic planning. Unknown to German intelligence, American military planners had been developing detailed plans for a two-front war since 1939. The so-called Rainbow Plans provided strategic frameworks for fighting simultaneous wars in Europe and the Pacific. While Pearl Harbor had disrupted American tactical preparations in the Pacific, it had not altered America's fundamental strategic approach to global warfare, the U-boat gambit. One of the primary factors that influenced Hitler's decision to declare war on America was the argument, strongly supported by Admiral Raeder and the German Navy, that unrestricted submarine warfare could strangle Britain's supply lines and force a negotiated peace before American industrial production could reach full capacity. The U-boat fleet had achieved significant successes against British shipping during 1940 and 1941, sinking hundreds of merchant vessels and seriously disrupting British imports of food, fuel, and raw materials. Hitler found this argument particularly appealing because it offered the prospect of decisive action against Britain without requiring massive additional resources. Germany in late 1941 was already straining to support military operations on multiple fronts. The ongoing war in Russia, the North African campaign, and the occupation of Western Europe. Adding a major new commitment of ground or air forces would have been difficult, if not impossible, but unleashing the U-boat fleet against American shipping required only the political decision to abandon the pretense of neutrality. The naval argument for unrestricted submarine warfare was based on detailed calculations of shipping capacity and destruction rates. Admiral Raeder's staff had determined that if German submarines could sink merchant vessels faster than Britain, and America could build replacements, the Allied war effort would eventually collapse from lack of supplies. The mathematics seemed compelling. German U-boats could sink ships much faster and more cheaply than Allied shipyards could replace them. But these calculations were based on several false assumptions that would prove fatal to German strategic planning. First, German naval planners seriously underestimated American shipbuilding capacity. The famous Liberty ships, mass-produced cargo vessels designed specifically to replace losses from submarine warfare, would ultimately be built at a rate that far exceeded German sinking capacity. American shipyards would launch nearly 3,000 merchant vessels during the war, more than replacing all losses to submarine attack. Second, German planners failed to anticipate the rapid improvements in Allied anti-submarine warfare techniques. The combination of improved radar, sonar, depth charges, and naval aviation would make submarine operations increasingly dangerous and less effective as the war progressed. By 1943, German U-boat losses would exceed new submarine construction, creating a death spiral that would ultimately eliminate the submarine threat entirely. Most importantly, German naval planners failed to understand that unrestricted submarine warfare against American shipping would provide the United States with the political justification it needed to prioritize the European war over the Pacific conflict. Hitler's declaration of war, followed by sustained U-boat attacks on American vessels, eliminated any domestic American pressure to focus primarily on Japan. Instead, it reinforced the Roosevelt administration's Germany First strategy and ensured that the full weight of American military and industrial power would eventually be brought to bear against Nazi Germany. The Eastern Front disaster, perhaps the most critical factor that made Hitler's declaration of war against America a strategic catastrophe, was the deteriorating situation on the Eastern Front. By December 1941, the German invasion of the Soviet Union, which Hitler had predicted would last only a few months, was bogging down in the face of fierce Soviet resistance and brutal winter weather. The German offensive, launched on June 22, 1941, had initially achieved spectacular tactical successes. German forces had advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, encircled and destroyed entire Soviet armies, and captured millions of prisoners. By early December, German forces were within sight of Moscow. Leningrad was under siege, and vast areas of European Russia were under German occupation. But these tactical victories had come at enormous cost. German casualties on the Eastern Front had already exceeded 750,000 men by December 1941, more than the total number of German soldiers killed during the entire First World War. German equipment losses were equally severe, with thousands of tanks, aircraft, and vehicles lost to combat, mechanical failure, and the harsh Russian winter. More ominously, Soviet resistance was stiffening rather than collapsing. The Red Army was bringing forward fresh divisions from Siberia and Central Asia, divisions that were better equipped for winter warfare than the German forces they faced. Soviet industrial production, relocated beyond the Urals and therefore safe from German bombing, was beginning to produce tanks, aircraft, and weapons in quantities that would eventually exceed German production. In this context, Hitler's decision to add America to Germany's list of enemies was strategic insanity. Germany was already fighting a war of attrition against an enemy whose population and industrial resources exceeded its own. The Soviet Union had 190 million people compared to Germany's 80 million, and Soviet steel production was rapidly approaching German levels. Adding America, with its 130 million people and vastly superior industrial capacity, to the anti-German coalition created odds that were simply insurmountable. German military planners understood these mathematics, even if Hitler refused to acknowledge them. General Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, wrote in his diary on December 11th, "The Führer's declaration of war against America has made our strategic situation hopeless. We are now fighting the three most powerful nations on earth simultaneously. Our only hope was to defeat one of our enemies quickly before the others could bring their full strength to bear. That hope is now gone." The manpower implications alone were staggering. Germany could mobilize perhaps 10 million men for military service without completely destroying its economy. The combined manpower of the Soviet Union, Britain, and America exceeded 400 million people. Even accounting for the fact that not all of this population could be mobilized for military service, the Allies would eventually field armies that outnumbered German forces by margins of 3 or 4 to 1. 1942, the year of consequences. The year 1942 would demonstrate conclusively that Hitler's declaration of war against America had been a strategic catastrophe of unprecedented proportions. What had seemed like a bold stroke in December 1941 would reveal itself as a decision that transformed a potentially manageable conflict into an unwinnable global war. The first major consequence became apparent in the Battle of the Atlantic. Hitler's unleashing of unrestricted submarine warfare against American shipping initially produced spectacular results. During the first 6 months of 1942, German U-boats sank over 3 million tons of Allied shipping, much of it within sight of the American coast. The period became known to German submariners as the Second Happy Time, as American coastal defences proved woefully inadequate against submarine attack. But the very success of the U-boat campaign galvanized American industrial response in ways that German planners had not anticipated. President Roosevelt declared shipbuilding a national priority, mobilizing American industrial capacity for the largest maritime construction program in history. The Liberty ship program alone would ultimately produce nearly 3,000 cargo vessels, while American shipyards simultaneously built hundreds of destroyers, escort carriers, and other anti-submarine vessels. More importantly, the submarine attacks on American shipping provided Roosevelt with the political justification he needed to implement the Germany First strategy, despite public pressure to focus on Japan. Every American merchant vessel sunk by German torpedoes reinforced the argument that Nazi Germany posed a direct threat to American security. By mid-1942, American military production was being allocated roughly equally between the European and Pacific theaters, ensuring that Germany would face the full weight of American industrial might. The industrial statistics were staggering. In 1942, American factories produced over 47,000 aircraft, compared to Germany's 15,000. American shipyards launched 8 million tons of new vessels, while German submarine construction totaled less than 200,000 tons. Perhaps most ominously for Germany, American tank production reached 24,000 units in 1942, while German production remained below 10,000 tanks for the entire year. These production figures represented only the beginning of American mobilization. By 1943, American war production would exceed that of all Axis nations combined. By 1944, the United States was producing military equipment in quantities that seemed almost incomprehensible to German planners. The B-24 Liberator bomber, for example, was being produced at the rate of 1 aircraft every 63 minutes at the peak of production. The Japanese bubble bursts. Hitler's confidence in Japanese military capabilities, which had been crucial to his decision to declare war on America, began to collapse within months of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese offensive in the Pacific, which had seemed irresistible in December 1941, reached its limits by mid-1942 and then began to reverse with devastating speed. The turning point came at the Battle of Midway in June 1942. Japanese naval forces attempting to capture the strategic Midway Atoll and destroy the remainder of the American Pacific Fleet instead suffered a crushing defeat that eliminated 4 of Japan's 6 large aircraft carriers and hundreds of experienced pilots. The battle demonstrated that American industrial capacity was already beginning to replace the losses from Pearl Harbor, while Japanese losses would prove irreplaceable. German intelligence reports from the Pacific began to paint an increasingly grim picture of Japanese prospects. The Japanese advance had stalled in New Guinea, been turned back in the Coral Sea, and suffered devastating losses at Midway. More ominously, American forces were beginning to take the offensive, launching attacks on Japanese positions in the Solomon Islands and preparing for a sustained campaign to roll back Japanese conquests. The strategic implications for Germany were profound. Hitler's declaration of war had been based on the assumption that Japan would tie down American forces in the Pacific for years to come, preventing America from concentrating its full strength against Germany. Instead, the Japanese were clearly losing their ability to maintain pressure on American forces. This meant that growing percentages of American military production would eventually be available for the European theatre. German military planners began to revise their assessments of the strategic balance in ways that painted an increasingly hopeless picture. If Japan could not maintain pressure on American forces, then America would eventually be able to concentrate its full industrial and military might against Germany. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. American production capacity exceeded German capacity by margins of 3 or 4 to 1. Once that production capacity was fully mobilized and directed against Germany, the outcome of the war would become inevitable. The Eastern Front collapse. The deteriorating situation in the Pacific was compounded by an equally catastrophic development on the Eastern Front. The German offensive against the Soviet Union, which Hitler had confidently predicted would conclude with Soviet surrender by the end of 1941, had instead become a grinding war of attrition that was consuming German manpower and equipment at unsustainable rates. The Soviet winter counteroffensive of 1941 to 1942 had driven German forces back from Moscow and inflicted hundreds of thousands of casualties on the Wehrmacht. German forces were no longer advancing, but were instead struggling to maintain defensive positions against increasingly effective Soviet attacks. The myth of German military invincibility, which had been crucial to Nazi morale and Allied fears, was beginning to collapse. More ominously, Soviet industrial production was not only surviving German attacks, but was actually increasing. The evacuation of Soviet factories to areas beyond the Urals had preserved much of Soviet manufacturing capacity, and new plants were being built at a rate that would soon exceed German production. Soviet tank production in 1942 would total over 24,000 units, compared to fewer than 10,000 German tanks. Soviet aircraft production would exceed 25,000 planes, dwarfing German output. The manpower situation was equally grim for Germany. The Soviet Union was mobilizing its vast population reserves for sustained warfare, while German manpower was already stretched thin across multiple fronts. German forces were fighting in Russia, North Africa, Western Europe, the Balkans, and Norway, while also maintaining occupation forces across conquered territories. The addition of American forces to this equation would create military pressures that Germany simply could not sustain. German generals were beginning to send increasingly desperate reports to Hitler about the strategic situation. General Halder wrote in his diary in June 1942, "The situation has become hopeless. We are fighting enemies whose combined resources exceed our own by enormous margins. Our only hope was to achieve quick victories that would force our enemies to negotiate. Instead, we have created a coalition that will inevitably destroy us through sheer weight of numbers and industrial production." The Allied coalition solidifies. Perhaps the most significant consequence of Hitler's declaration of war was the creation of the Grand Alliance between Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States. This alliance, which would prove to be the most effective military coalition in history, was forged directly by Hitler's decision to fight all three powers simultaneously. Prior to December 1941, the relationship between these three nations had been marked by suspicion and conflicting interests. Britain and the Soviet Union had been enemies during the Russian Revolution and the subsequent intervention. The United States had maintained correct but cool relations with both nations, while American public opinion remained strongly opposed to involvement in European conflicts. Hitler's declaration of war transformed this situation overnight. Britain and America were now formal allies, bound together by shared enemies and common objectives. The Soviet Union, while not technically allied with Britain and America, was effectively part of the same coalition through the logic of military necessity. All three nations now had compelling reasons to coordinate their efforts and share resources in the fight against Nazi Germany. The industrial implications of this alliance were staggering. The combined steel production of Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States exceeded German production by a factor of more than 4 to 1. Combined aircraft production would ultimately exceed German output by margins of 6 or 7 to 1. Most importantly, the alliance created opportunities for strategic coordination that would prove devastating to German defensive planning. The Combined Chiefs of Staff, established in early 1942, created unprecedented levels of military cooperation between British and American forces. Strategic bombing campaigns could be coordinated to maximize damage to German industrial capacity. Naval operations could be integrated to maximize pressure on German supply lines. Most importantly, the alliance could plan and execute the massive amphibious operations that would ultimately open a second front in Western Europe. By the end of 1942, less than 1 year after Hitler's fateful declaration, the strategic balance of World War II had shifted decisively against Germany. The three most powerful industrial nations on Earth were now coordinating their efforts against the Axis powers. German forces were in retreat on multiple fronts. German cities were beginning to suffer sustained bombing attacks, and German industrial production was falling behind Allied output by margins that grew larger each month. 1943. The turning of the tide. The year 1943 would demonstrate beyond any doubt that Hitler's six-word decision to support Japan by declaring war on America had sealed Nazi Germany's fate. What had seemed like a moment of defiant strength in December 1941 revealed itself as the beginning of an inexorable march toward defeat and destruction. The statistics told the story with merciless clarity. American war production in 1943 exceeded the combined output of all Axis nations. The United States alone produced over 85,000 aircraft that year, compared to Germany's production of fewer than 25,000 planes. American shipyards launched over 19 million tons of new vessels, while German naval construction remained below 300,000 tons. Perhaps most significantly, American steel production reached 89 million tons in 1943, nearly 4 times Germany's output of 23 million tons. But numbers alone could not capture the full scope of the strategic transformation that Hitler's declaration had unleashed. The alliance between Britain, the Soviet Union, and the United States was now functioning as an integrated war machine, coordinating attacks on multiple fronts, while steadily increasing pressure on German defensive capabilities. The combined bomber offensive was devastating German cities and industrial facilities. Soviet forces were advancing along the entire Eastern Front. Allied naval forces had gained decisive superiority in the Atlantic, ending the U-boat threat that had been Germany's last hope for forcing a negotiated peace. The Battle of Stalingrad, which ended with German surrender in February 1943, symbolized the complete reversal of German military fortunes. The German Sixth Army, which had once seemed invincible, was destroyed in its entirety. Over 200,000 German soldiers were killed or captured in a single battle, losses that exceeded total German casualties from the entire first year of the war. The myth of German military superiority was shattered forever. Meanwhile, American forces were gaining experience and confidence in both the Pacific and European theatres. The invasion of Italy in September 1943 opened a second front in Europe, forcing Germany to divert resources from the Eastern Front. American bombing campaigns against German industrial targets were systematically destroying the economic foundation of the Nazi war effort. Most ominously for Germany, preparations were beginning for Operation Overlord, the massive invasion of France that would create a third major front and make Germany's strategic situation completely untenable. The human cost of Hitler's decision. As we reflect on this pivotal moment in history, it's important to remember that Hitler's decision to declare war on America was not merely a strategic error. It was a choice that condemned millions of people to death and suffering on a scale almost beyond comprehension. The 6 words that Ribbentrop spoke in December 1941, "We must support our Japanese allies," unleashed a cascade of consequences that would ultimately claim the lives of over 60 million people. The expansion of World War II from a regional conflict into a truly global war prolonged the fighting by at least 2 years, and possibly longer. Had Hitler chosen to remain neutral after Pearl Harbor, allowing America to focus its attention on Japan, while Britain faced Germany alone, the war in Europe might have ended differently, and certainly would have ended sooner. The additional years of fighting meant additional years of Holocaust operations, additional years of brutal occupation policies, and additional years of military casualties on all sides. The Holocaust itself was intensified and accelerated by the pressures created by global war. Nazi policies toward European Jews became increasingly radical as German military fortunes declined. The Wannsee Conference, which formalized plans for the final solution, took place in January 1942, just weeks after Hitler's declaration of war against America. The systematic murder of European Jews was implemented most extensively during 1942 and 1943, precisely the period when Germany's strategic situation was becoming hopeless due to the expanding global conflict. Military casualties mounted exponentially as the war expanded beyond Europe. The Eastern Front alone claimed the lives of over 20 million Soviet civilians and military personnel. The strategic bombing campaigns that became possible once America entered the war killed hundreds of thousands of German civilians. The Pacific War, prolonged by Germany's decision to support Japan, cost millions of additional lives in Asia and the Pacific Islands. Perhaps most tragically, many of these deaths could have been avoided if Hitler had made different choices in December 1941. The war was not yet global or total in its scope. Regional conflicts might have been resolved through negotiation once the immediate military objectives had been achieved. Instead, Hitler's decision to declare war on America transformed a series of regional conflicts into an apocalyptic struggle for the future of civilization itself. The story of those 6 words, "We must support our Japanese allies," offers profound lessons about the nature of leadership, decision-making, and the unintended consequences of political choices. Hitler's decision was not made in isolation or under immediate military pressure. He had 3 days to consider the implications of declaring war on America, access to detailed intelligence about American industrial capacity, and advice from military experts who understood the strategic risks involved. Yet Hitler chose to prioritize ideological considerations over strategic logic, loyalty to allies over careful calculation of costs and benefits, and emotional satisfaction over rational analysis. The decision felt right to him because it aligned with his worldview and satisfied his psychological needs for bold action and ideological purity. The fact that it was strategically catastrophic became apparent only later, when the full consequences of global war had been unleashed. This pattern of leaders making decisions based on ideological conviction or emotional satisfaction, rather than careful analysis of likely outcomes, has repeated itself throughout history. The tendency to prioritize short-term political or psychological benefits over long-term strategic consequences appears to be a persistent weakness in human decision-making, particularly among leaders who possess great power but limited accountability. The story also illustrates how individual decisions can have consequences far beyond anything their makers intended or imagined. Ribbentrop's 6 words were intended to preserve German strength and maintain alliance relationships. Instead, they condemned Nazi Germany to destruction and transformed a regional conflict into the most destructive war in human history. The gap between intention and outcome serves as a sobering reminder of how difficult it can be to predict the ultimate consequences of political decisions. By May 1945, just 3.5 years after Hitler's declaration of war against America, Nazi Germany lay in ruins. Hitler himself was dead by suicide in his Berlin bunker, surrounded by the wreckage of the empire he had boasted would last 1,000 years. German cities were devastated by bombing and artillery fire. The German economy had collapsed entirely. German military forces had surrendered unconditionally to the Allied powers. The cost of Hitler's decision could be measured in every possible dimension. Militarily, Germany had lost over 4 million soldiers, more than any previous war in German history. Economically, the country's industrial capacity had been reduced to a fraction of its pre-war levels. Politically, Germany had been divided into occupation zones controlled by its former enemies. Morally, the revelation of Holocaust atrocities had destroyed Germany's international reputation for generations to come. Perhaps most significantly, Hitler's decision had created the conditions for American emergence as a global superpower. The United States in 1941 had been a reluctant participant in international affairs, focused primarily on domestic concerns and hoping to avoid entanglement in foreign conflicts. By 1945, America had become the world's dominant military and economic power, with global responsibilities and interests that would shape international relations for decades to come. The Soviet Union, too, emerged from the war as a superpower, controlling vast territories in Eastern Europe and possessing military capabilities that could challenge American interests around the world. The Cold War that would dominate international relations for the next 4 decades was made possible by the destruction of German power and the emergence of the American-Soviet rivalry to fill the resulting power vacuum. In this sense, Hitler's 6 words did more than doom Nazi Germany. They reshaped the entire structure of international relations and created the bipolar world order that would define global politics for the remainder of the 20th century. The decision that was intended to preserve German strength and ensure Nazi victory instead created the conditions for American and Soviet dominance of world affairs. As we conclude tonight's journey through this pivotal moment in history, we're reminded that the fate of nations often turns on moments of individual decision-making that seem almost mundane in their immediate context. 6 words spoken in a private conversation between 2 men in a Berlin office change the course of world history and determine the fate of millions of people who had no voice in the decision. The story serves as a sobering reminder of the awesome responsibility that comes with political leadership and the potentially catastrophic consequences of decisions made without careful consideration of their full implications. It also reminds us that history is not inevitable, that different choices could have led to different outcomes, and that individual human beings, for better or worse, have the power to shape the destiny of their nations and their world. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll reflect on the weight of decision-making and the unexpected ways that single moments can alter the trajectory of human history. The 6 words that doomed an empire remind us that in politics, as in life, the choices we make often have consequences far beyond anything we can imagine at the time. And with that thought, we conclude our exploration of the 6 words that convinced Hitler to declare war on America. Sweet dreams, and may this story of human decision-making and its consequences provide food for peaceful contemplation as you rest.